What I'd like to do is start in the same way that I start pretty much every conversation and every presentation that I give in relation to democracy, which strangely is becoming a very large part of my life. The first thing I'd like to do is actually ask everybody to think about these three questions. Do you believe that there is any worldview or ideology that has the solution to every problem that faces us today? And when we talk about worldview, whether it's religious, whether it's political, whether it's social, that there's one particular slant, there's one particular perspective that can solve every problem that sits in front of us. I'm not looking for an answer, I just want you to think about it. The next question is, do you think the current political system represents everybody equally and everybody has an equal voice? And then the third question that I want you to think about is whether or not your existing government, whether the existing leaders in our democracy actually enact the will of the people and do what the majority of constituents want. I'm going to let you think about those things, but invariably when I give this speech around the world, at least one of those answers is no. Usually all three of them are no. And on that basis is the context for why we're here. And it's the context for why MiVote was created. Because there's something fundamentally wrong with our democracy. In fact, MiVote would put to you that democracy doesn't exist. Not even close. Democracy is about the enactment of the will of the people, and you cannot enact the will of the people if you do not ask the people what they want. If you can figure out a way to do it, to know what the majority of constituents want on a policy-by-policy basis without asking them, then you are a genius, let me tell you. And I'm looking in Parliament in Canberra, and I'm not seeing many geniuses floating around there. So what I want to do is have you think about how we got to where we got to and why it's important, particularly given the conversation we've just had around whether or not it's retrofitting, which was a terrific question, whether or not it's about disruption, whether or not it's about starting something new from the grassroots and having it build, or starting it from top down. It doesn't really matter. What really matters is why. Why is it important? So my grandmother, Orma, we call her, is 99 years old. And when I speak to my grandmother about the world in which she lived and grew up in Europe, 80 odd years ago, 90 odd years ago, everything about her existence was different. Transport, travel, finance, entertainment, communication, everything about the world was different. Unrecognisable from then to now. The governance system is the same. We continue to govern ourselves and make decisions for all of us based on a world that does not exist anymore. How insane is that? Now, the reality is that true democracy has never existed. It couldn't, because technology didn't allow it to exist. You couldn't have a situation when in real time you could understand what the majority of the population wanted on an issue-by-issue basis, because you couldn't have that dialogue. But in 2016, when you can have a one-to-many, many-to-many and many-to-one conversation, it is inexcusable that we don't do it right. There is simply no reason that we are not enacting the will of the people every day. That's why MiVote exists. So we're going to talk to you about how we're a little bit different and how genuine democracy can in fact exist and thrive despite the fact that people are becoming a bit disenchanted by it. So what are we? Well, MiVote is a social and political movement. We're not a political party, we're a movement. And we fundamentally exist using technology to ensure that we democratise democracy. We bring back the will of the people, we have a dialogue with our constituency, and first and foremost, politicians move from being self-serving to being civic-serving. That being a representative of the populace actually means you represent the populace, not a particular ideology, a particular party, a particular seat that you would like to continue to sit in for who knows how many decades. And that comes with a whole lot of strings to actually represent people. It comes with transparency. It requires accountability. It requires a dialogue and an understanding that there are no silver bullet answers to any of the major problems that confront us. But we'll get to that shortly. But let me very quickly touch on these things. The will of the people. So we've spoken at the end of the day that democracy is about the will of the people, and you have to be able to ensure and enshrine in what you do that the people that you represent are actually getting delivered to them what was promised to them. So independent of your political philosophy and ideology, independent of whether you voted for Labor or Liberal or Greens or One Nation, it doesn't make any difference. The reality is that things are promised to us before an election that never happen after an election. That should be illegal. If you are going to stand in front of the Australian population and promise one thing and 24 hours later make an excuse for why you can't do it, there should be ramifications for that. And they shouldn't be 3 years away, because we can have a dialogue now. We can understand what people want now. So non-ideological, let's talk about that for a second, because this is quite controversial. One of the things that's unique about MiVote is we don't talk about legislation. We talk about destination. We have quite deliberately uncoupled the relationship between democracy and legislation in Parliament. And we do that because legislation already comes ideologically compromised. It's written by one side of politics or the other side of politics. And they are presenting a solution to a problem in the way that they see the world. And that's okay. You're entitled to that view of the world. What we're not entitled to do in a democracy is not allow for the other views to be presented. What we're also not allowed to do in a genuine democracy is ensure that the information pertaining to the issue is not easily accessible or digestible to the people who need to vote. So if what you have is the cherry picking of data out of research to support your worldview, and you do not acknowledge that there might be some inconvenient data that supports the view of your opposition, then we are in a very dangerous place. Because what we're saying is we advocate for one particular perspective, despite the fact that facts might suggest otherwise, and that there might be a better solutions orientation for all of us. And informed citizenry is an obvious next step to the point that I just made. If you don't know the truth, if facts are not available, and if a variety of options are not presented to you, how can you possibly make an informed decision? How can you actually vote for something you don't know or don't understand? What MiVote advocates is that the first and primary responsibility, the most important responsibility of any government is to inform its citizens. And given that the Parliament is meant to be representative of the people, which means they work for us, let that one sink in for a minute, they work for us, then save for issues of national security, there is nothing that should not be accessible to the people. Because if you are intending for us to make a decision about where we go as a people together for the next 100 years, how are we meant to make that decision without actually understanding it? So MiVote embeds into everything that we do as a part of our constitutional process that we have to inform citizens on 4 different directions on every single policy issue. So rather, for example, if we just use asylum seekers, because it's been topical in the last 3 elections and it's the issue that never goes away because we can't quite get it right, what we have at the moment is a conversation about Manus or Nauru or Malaysia, or it's your fault, but you actually built the first camp, but you didn't let them in, but they died on your watch, etc., etc. What we need to do is take that conversation back to a much higher place, a much more fundamental place as a country, and stop talking about legislative outcome and solution and start talking about destination. Where do we as a country want to go? So MiVote, as an example, rather than saying a binary yes and no digitally, do you support the bill, do you not support the bill, which I should add is what every current democratic innovation in the world is doing. All they're effectively doing is turning the existing system into a yes and no app. What MiVote does is it says, no, we're not having that conversation. That's the wrong conversation for us as a people. What we're going to talk about is where we want to go. So do you want, on the asylum seeker issue, as an example, for your country to take a primarily humanitarian approach? Or do you want it to take primarily a border security approach? Or do you want it primarily to take a financially pragmatic approach? Or do you want it to take an international diplomacy approach? And they are all fundamentally different things. And what we do is present, through our technology, what it means to believe in any of those particular destinations. So if you support a humanitarian approach, these are the things you would support and these are the things you wouldn't. If you support a national security approach, these are the things that you would support and not. And we do it in such a way that there is enough information for a whole variety, a breadth of different kinds of people in our community. Some people want the Channel 9 fast food sitting on the couch version of politics, and that's okay. The idea that there are some of us who are better thinkers and therefore others shouldn't be listened to, that Churchillian idea about how, the most dangerous thing to do is listen to the population, is so elitist and disgusting that I or you, because you've gone to university, have an inherent right to make a decision on behalf of others. What you have to do is provide the information to them in a way that they can understand it, and I don't mean that in a negative way, I mean it fits into their lifestyle. So for some people, look at an issue and get the dot point version. Humanitarian, these are the things. Here are the 10 things you'd support, here are the 10 things you couldn't. Here's how it lines up against the existing legislative landscape. Others will sit back and go, I think that feels right to me, but I'm not entirely sure, and cascade down in the app, and then get a 4 or 5 page précis and understand the trends and the issues and some research reports. So, transparent and accountable. Everything we do at MiVote is accessible to all of the members. All the information. So when you get to the bottom of the information packs, there is a link that says resource. So you as a member can see all of the journals, all of the research documents, should you choose to, that our own research team is using to create the frames themselves. So you can go as deep as you'd like. The whiz-bangery, the app, the technology, the blockchain, that's the sexiness. People love it, it's new, it works. But the reality is technology does not make democracy. It doesn't even come close to making a democracy. Democracy is made by the system of decision-making, the level of governance that you put into place to ensure that it is fair, it is reasonable, it can be replicated, it's transferable, it's accountable, it's transparent. The things that you see in the posters at the back of the room explain how MiVote does that differently to every other political movement on the planet. Whether it plays out, only time is going to tell. Whether the thinking that sits behind it is 1,000 times better than the existing system, there is no doubt. It's better than the existing system. Is it perfect? No, nothing's perfect. But we think we're a lot better than what's out there at the moment. Equality of voice. This is fundamental to a democracy. Your voice is not more important than mine, or his, or hers. We each get one vote, we each get one voice. Not by virtue of whether or not you live in Toorak, not by virtue of whether or not you went to university, not by virtue of whether or not you came on a boat. If you are an Australian citizen now, and you are eligible to vote, and you are going to have to live with the outcome of the decision that happens in this country, your vote is exactly the same value as anybody else's. That's what the MiVote system does. One person, one vote on every issue that you choose to engage with. Nobody else can offer that. The way that we enact some of those things are here. No corporate donations, no lobby group money, no interest group money, no way for a donor to have accessibility to the policy team because it's a 4-pronged process. Couldn't do it. Can't buy your way in. Can't push your way through with ideology, because every voice will have an opportunity through our framing, and so there's no point paying us to try and provide the outcome, because in all likelihood, your version, your destinational version of reality will be there anyway. Whether or not people choose to vote on it is an entirely different matter. And the other thing that's important about that is whether you put in $1 or whether you put in $100 million, your name and the amount will be on the website for everybody to see. 100% transparency on where our money comes from and how we operate. So what we have is a situation now where we can actually genuinely say it is a movement built by the people for the people, because the donations that we have are by individuals who just want to circuit break what's going on with a method that enables people to have greater fairness in the way decisions are made about where we go in the future. And interestingly, if you think about how some of those decisions get made, MiVote's also the only group at the moment who accepts votes for 16-year-olds as opposed to 18-year-olds. Why? Because if you think about the absurdity of the Brexit vote, you have a group of people that voted for a direction, and the vast majority who voted for it are over 55 years of age. The people who are going to have to live through that were not able to vote, the vast majority of them. So to say, we've lived longer, therefore we understand better, is absurd if the right kind of information can be provided. So the people who have to actually experience the outcome of the decisions that get made must have a seat at the table. And what you'll see in the way that our governance model works is an embedding decision-making process where we have advisory committees built in: elderly, disabled, youth vote, LGBTI, gender equality, Indigenous community and others. And every policy must go through that group to at least for them to provide a perspective. We need to understand, if we're talking about jobs policy or education policy or health policy, what do those groups who are largely unheard in our system have to say about those issues? That doesn't mean that what they want they're always going to get, but it's imperative that they have a voice, and it's imperative that they can help frame the conversation, because they're going to have to live through it like everybody else. But they're marginalised because they don't have enough in and of themselves to sway an election. That's the meat. We're done with the heavy stuff now. So what we have now, just to give you a very quick contextual sense of what's happening with MiVote. So MiVote was a finalist at the Singularity University Grand Global Challenge Awards this year in San Francisco, and identified as one of the 4 governance models that could have a positive impact on 1 billion people's lives, which was an extraordinary honour and took all of us by surprise, I can assure you. But we went and we presented, and the results of that presentation has been more staggering than any of us could ever have hoped for. What came as a result was that currently, and that needs to be updated because as of yesterday, and the Romanians, we're now at 23 countries that would like to start a MiVote chapter. And there's dialogue with every country there plus Romania. And what happened when we got off that stage, apart from the fact that this was built with an Australian context and an Australian intent, because that's the place that we play, what we've learned is that the conversation that we're having and the kind of democracy we're presenting as an alternative is resonating everywhere. Everybody's saying it makes sense that democracy should be about the will of the people. It makes sense that corporates shouldn't be able to drive policy. It makes sense that everybody should have one equal voice. And so that's starting to live out. We've been featured in all of those magazines and a number of others. What you'll see later this week is a 900-word feature in The Guardian. We're in HuffPost next week, and so it goes. At this stage, it's every 36 hours we're doing an interview somewhere in the world. And it's not because it's perfect, but it's because it's better than what exists and people have had enough. Are we going to get it out of the gate exactly as it needs to be? No, it's iterative. It will evolve. Will it be the best system forever? Of course it won't, just as the existing system is not going to live forever. Digital democracy is an inevitability. The only question is, which version of digital democracy is going to win? Which one is going to be the most prevalent around the world? So we say, in San Francisco, we don't want to be the MySpace of democracy, we want to be the Facebook of democracy. We want to be the thing that people go to every day because that's how they live their lives. We don't want to be the thing that's hot for 3 months and then disappears off the face of the earth, which is why so much time has been put into governance structures, ethics boards, involving the community, building it the right way. It's taken 4 years to get to this point. This isn't a fly-by-night startup. So our growth, this is what we want. This is serious. People are going to think, holy smokes, this guy's nuts. This is reality. This is what the 100+ volunteers that we currently have are working towards. November 2018, we will have the next federal election in this country. We want 3 Senate seats, we want 1 million members, and we want 5,000 volunteers. I should also add we'll be in 20 countries. We want to be the largest single-branded political movement on the planet, and we want that inside 5 years. Right now, that mantle belongs to the Greens Party, and whilst I personally empathise with a whole lot of what they have to say, they are nevertheless ideological. We want to make sure that people everywhere on the earth have the opportunity to have self-determination as they are. Vote on the things on an issue-by-issue basis that represents them. Can you think of any person in your entire life with which you agree with everything? You don't disagree on anything? Of course not. Your religious group, your social group, your footy club, of course. So why is it we vote for parties thinking they can represent us perfectly? It's so insane that we do it. So the reality for us is we're a tech startup. We're an official brand for the last, 9 months? Officially launched. But we don't take corporate donations. We don't have lobby groups punting at our door. This is a movement built by individuals. And this is where I hit you up for money. This is the bit right now. So ordinarily, my 25 years as a startup entrepreneur would be a conversation about the equity exchange and the share A versions of shares and B versions of shares and the kind of return you can expect for your investment. Let me tell you, I'm not going to have that conversation with you today. Whilst all of you work on businesses for quarterly profit returns, and there is nothing wrong with that. I did it for 25 years. There's nothing wrong with it. We're working on a different measurement. Whether or not the world is a better world for your children, and their children. I started this because as a father of 4, I was deeply concerned that every day the voice of my children was becoming less and less important. And as a father, you can sit back, as I did for many years, and bitch and moan on Twitter and have a crack at everybody who's prepared to listen, look like a lunatic. Or actually you can say, let's invest some time and energy into fixing it. Whether or not this works, whether or not we become the biggest political movement on the planet, I don't know. Only time is going to tell. What I know is that right now I can look my children in the eye and say, as their father, I did what I could to try and fix it. What I want is your contribution to help us fix it. And not just for my children, but for your children. What I'd like to do now is invite Steve Graham to the stage. Steve Graham is our major patron. He is a man who never asks for anything in return for his generosity. Nothing. A story that I tell a bit, which is 100% true. Richard, who was up on stage before, asked me last September to write the manifesto, which is a word I hate, by the way, but I like to think of it as a positioning document for MiVote. And I wrote that document, and after I sent it to Richard, he sent it off to a few people. One of those people was Steve. And I didn't know Steve at that point. We'd never met. I'd never heard of you. Didn't know your name. Nothing about you. But I woke up the next morning after I sent it to Richard from an email from Steve, who generously said, I've just read this manifesto about this thing, which at the time was called Frame Democracy. It wasn't called MiVote at that point. And he said, I have 8 grandchildren, and I'm going to give you $5,000 for every grandchild that I have, because it's the first thing I've seen that will help make the world a better place for them. That's an extraordinarily generous thing to do when you don't know what the movement's really about. You've never met the people who are involved. You believe in the idea, and you've read a document that has moved you to invest what you can in social good. That's extraordinary. Well, since then, this incredibly generous individual and his wife have put in more than $500,000 to MiVote.
I'm glad she's not here.
Yeah. I thought she was going to be. And we would just like to express some gratitude, Nick, you can take it out, and say thank you for that generosity and being a protector of democracy. The other thing that we're going to do that Steve and Margaret don't know anything about is we're officially naming our patrons area the Steve and Margaret Graham Patron Circle. So thank you very much. Give them a big round of applause.
I love this guy.
We love you more. I'm not going to go into much detail here. Suffice to say that anybody who is interested in contributing and becoming part of the growth of this movement, we are very clear in the way that a traditional investment would take place and a traditional startup would take place about where we spend our money and what we expect in return for that expenditure. So I'm happy to walk people through and make this available to anybody, but we know how to grow and where to grow. So as an example, at the $1 million mark, it's marketing, comms, executive appointments. Right now we're a volunteer organisation, but there's a point where you have to start actually building full-time teams of people to handle the growth, the attention, and the workload. National chapter development, so ensuring that there is a MiVote representative in every state, as an example. Research and ensuring that we have the research frames. When you go back and have a look at how that process works, you'll understand why we need to spend money on it. And then in-house production, because what we intend to do, although we are new and fresh and blockchainy and techie, but right now a lot of that content is in text form. With investment, it will be in video form. It will be accessible in multiple languages. We're able to actually develop the conversation about the issues so that it really genuinely is accessible for everybody. Thank you very much.